Hello, and welcome to the Figuring Things Out podcast. Inspired by our favourite metaphor, each series explores various ideas around a given theme. This allows us to take a journey through a wide range of perspectives and travel towards greater clarity. For our first series, we'll explore the question, what is movement? And in the process, speak to 5 teachers, performers, and all-round wonderful humans. I think that's always the way, I think there's something about recreating or trying to refine like a feeling. Like even if you're improvising or something, or you're going through something, and I find that a lot with climbing. If I send a route and I'm really proud and I want to get a video, usually it's post, and I'll do it again. And I'm so focused on, okay, I want to get this on video and make the climb look really great. I miss the aspect of just being in the moment of the climb, and it ruins that feeling.
Yeah, this was an insight that I came upon recently as well, which is, oftentimes I'll start my sessions, really kind of my warm up is improvisation. And so when it's fresh and I'm in that, let's say, creative space, in this kind of open space where nothing has really come in yet, something magical happens. And then what I find is, let's say like 10 minutes go by, and inside of the improv, there's a technical skill that starts to show up that starts to kind of dirty the improvisation. So it's almost like I lose it, because then I'm like, oh, it's almost an unlearning process. All of the terminology that's been gathered ends up making it look like something I've already done. So it's an interesting, I don't know if that's quite what you're referring to, but now to me, that first, let's say 10 minutes is very special, because I don't really know what's going to come up yet. So anyway,
that zone of surprise almost.
Yeah, it's it's not, and I'm not even using prompts. I'm not using anything. So there is an element of surprise, but then I start to get in my own way. And all what is getting in my way is we could say, like, education, or the things that I've learned, all the techniques, all the skills, they're needed for the improv, but then at some point they get in the way of the improv. So
I think similarly to goals, they're markers.
Yeah.
As well. The markers of proficiency or of accessibility.
Yeah.
Or inspiration simply. But sometimes they get in the way because of their expectations. And you expect that you should or could or have to do X, Y, and Z. And you lose that zone.
Yeah, and like you said too, there's an observer. The observer in this case could be your own video, your own camera. So that actually has a interesting. This is something I've been working on. It has an interesting feltness to it. You feel the camera is now on, and it's like it's a weird deal.
Yeah. And the felt sense is so different to the scene sense. Let's say the retrospective kind of. That felt amazing. Oh.
And it looks like garbage.
Yeah. And how you present that. Let's actually take a step back. We've kind of been riffing, and I'd love to introduce you properly, and then we'll come back to this. So,
great.
Firstly, Brian Johson, welcome to the Figuring Things Out podcast. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Excited to share.
Yeah, I'm really excited. I think that, like I was saying off air, there's really a lovely space that you come from of let's say fitness culture primarily in a recent history, or a long recent history, and then you've come to this space of learning and sharing and teaching that's very dynamic and very unique and still quite clear. And I'd love to try and present that in a certain way and really dive into this concept of movement with you. I read on your Instagram, it says equal parts logic and magic. Holistically minded physiologist. Tell me more. That's great.
Yeah, well, first off, I like to kind of live in this paradox of, we've got logic on one side, which you and I we talked a little bit about, this practical side. And then the magical side is not knowing what's going to arise. So this maybe getting into the improvisation, newness, life, what can emerge from, in this case, a practical approach. So it's really what I found from a holistic standpoint is allowing for both of those, because I do think and find that they are they've been necessary for me. The holistic element has evolved for me over the years. My background is as a physiologist. I worked in a clinical setting for many years, and it started originally as this idea of prevention from that space. And prevention, at least here in the US, didn't look holistic to me. It was let's catch it after it's already. And so then that continued to evolve into then what became more hippy dippy holism, which we can maybe relate to, thinking that was just the other side of the coin. And it was like logic and magic in a way. And so coming to recognize now holism as this ongoing, for lack of a better descriptor, self-discovery, and being able to, amalgamate all of these different concepts and ideas, hold many perspectives, which it sounds like this conversation is about in the first place, and figure out a path that works for each individual. So there's a bit of a differentiation there, or an individualization, I guess you could say, it is through experience, it's through practice, but it's also taking in these other, perspectives and ideas.
So how do you communicate that to your local community? So let's go back a step, actually. So the movement standard is very much a gym, we could say, in a certain sense, a studio, somewhere that you're teaching regularly, if not daily, to a continual group of people coming in for one-to-one or class, which is, I think, maybe an interesting perspective to see movement through. We usually see movement in these greater contexts that are really deep and meaningful and impactful, where we have a workshop with 50 plus people, or a week-long retreat or intensive where we have a deep dive and we really have this felt sense of something greater. And then you come to this place of a boutique style gym, let's say, for want of a better word, and it's like, oh wow, how do you communicate that sense of meaning, that sense of greater self-discovery to your local community?
That's a great question. I think also, just to reference what you were saying about workshops, it's quite a bit different here in the US, where it seems, from my perspective, there's more opportunity for these immersive experiences in Europe and, overseas, not here in the US. And I think this model just became an extension of how I was already living my life. So it, in that way, just happened. I could have easily, I guess, fallen into teaching and kind of traveling and doing that sort of thing. But being rooted here in Dallas, I thought, okay, well, I want a place where I can practice, which is why really the space is rather small. And it started initially as a way for me to offer individual coaching, and then expanded into people being interested in what it was that I was doing personally. So then that extended into offering classes. And at first it was like 3 classes a week. Now we have days where we might offer 2 classes in a day, but it's still not a full scheduled, blown out. I would say, to maybe more specifically answer your question, some of that comes through just the teaching and the practice itself, but then me walking my own walk and just being an example of that, and having other teachers that also live and walk in that way, to where it can model what is possible. So, it does come out in what's said or what is done. But to me, it seems like it's, again, a very practical way to represent, outside of, let's say, an immersive experience, how the day-to-day can go. So.
Yeah. A big feeling I get there is consistency. You have this great, with the writing perspective, can be consistent.
Absolutely. That in itself can be challenging in a group space. You may have found this, in the sense that the consistency that we're talking about, and that might be required, let's say, for specific skills, may not, it's harder to communicate in a class setting. So there is this element of this space, which I've continued to try to promote it as a hybrid space from the standpoint of we do offer a lot of open gym personal practice time. And the classes, the way that I try and promote the class is that it's a taste for your own self exploration and discovery. It's not the practice itself. And this can often be, now here's the deal. If somebody wants to use it for their sole practice, that's, maybe it's more of a, in their perspective, it's more of just a physical representation of how they want to move, but they don't necessarily want to develop this deep, very time intensive personal practice. That's totally fine, and we're here for that. But I also continue to communicate that if that depth is desired and these certain skills are wanting to be oriented toward, then there needs to also be the personal side. So it's that I had this little Venn diagram that I drew one time, which was taking the individual practice and the community practice, and there's kind of an exponentiality that happens when the two do come together. Because in the class setting, there is a bit of a novelty effect that can then inspire my personal practice, and vice versa. So yeah, it seems like a nice little marriage of the two.
This podcast is currently a self-funded project. So if you're enjoying the conversations and would like to get involved and support us in creating more, please feel free to buy us a coffee with the link in the description. To see our coaching, courses, and event offers, please visit our website at www.figuringthingsout.com. For now, back to the podcast. Yeah, I feel like practicing with other people provides such a mirror, whether it's in a competitive environment or collaborative environment, or just simply like I don't know, like a metamorphic or some kind of osmosis environment where you just soak in from other people without realizing.
100%.
It's always inspiration. Going back to the consistency point, one thing I'm interested in always is when the individual and the communal practices marry, there's always some problems because the individual practice is always so varied. And you have different needs of different individuals, different ways of working, different lifestyles. And I've really come to see that a lot of the people, so when I do online coaching with a lot of students, I get them to do a simple Braverman test. And as a physiologist, you might berate me for this, but I really like it as a low resolution idea, as something that gives me an idea of their individual bias on a physiological level or neurochemical level, and use that to help me support their practice moving forward. And what I found is that about 90% of the people that come through are acetylcholine dominant. And so they're the type of people that are very good at dealing with a variety of stimulus and chaos and new things. And I wonder, in the local community, you must have people of all types. Let's say you might have people that need consistency in the same thing every session and really, time and depth with one topic. And other people that need a new thing every session to make them feel satiated and inspired. And I wonder how you marry all those needs and wants and desires in that world.
Yeah, that's a great question as well. I think, in my own experience, as I continue to evolve my practice, it does feel like there's an ongoing development of perspectives. So starting with, we talked a little bit about bodybuilding and then kind of working these perspectives along the way. It allows me to, it's not necessarily an assumption because there are questions asked that are leading questions or clues left to where someone's perspective might be, and allowing a little bit more openness to allowing them to learn for themselves what and how to select, material in this case, but also in that there's kind of this buffet of opportunity for them to, again, taste these different areas and decide, again, building this discernment where they want to self-direct. So it's I would say it's consistent enough in the foundations of practice, but tasteful enough to allow them to get some of these peripheral layers of practice. Let's say something like, getting into improvisational spinal material, or working with objects, or, these different things that maybe out of context might not resonate, but they can at least try it, and we put it in some sort of frame of reference where then they can decide if they want to practice or insert that. But what I found is what we would consider to be the foundations, most people never move beyond. So in terms of the consistency side, and there are a number of different ideas I have as to why that might be, but our bulk of our classes, I teach kind of 2 exploratory classes a week, but the bulk of our classes are centered around these small little like 5 to 10 minute tastes of different containers of practice, and then really rooting down into the fundamentals. So I'm not sure if that fully answers your question, but it's I think allowing for a bit of novelty in the taste of things, and then the recognition that, and continual expressing through teaching the need for consistency of these foundations, because in many ways, some of the skills that people are after, not all, but as in building these more complex skills, if you have a house of cards, it's not going to last very long, or you're just never going to get there, and you're going to get frustrated and lose motivation. So, if someone does have a benchmark for a specific skill, making sure that they understand that these foundational layers need to be intact to a certain degree. And then if they do want to continue to progress towards that skill, maybe something like an individual practice needs to be sought for to individualize the process a bit more. So yeah, I don't have a clear, direct, specific answer to that, but it's a bit of all of it.
Could you maybe define how you see the foundations?
Yeah, that's a great question too. I don't believe there are foundations. No, I mean, I don't. I mean, the foundations that we approximate are in direct proportion with the community that shows up here. So, it's like I could have foundations of, let's say, learning where the hips are in weight shifting, but out of context with what people actually want, they may not come back. Because ultimately, in many ways, at least I've found, we want what we want on the front end, but don't really understand fully what's behind it or underneath it. And so there is, I think, room for those things outside of what we would consider the foundations to be, but starting a little bit more central and closer to where most people are finding us from, which is, let's say, CrossFit gyms, yoga studios, Pilates studios, dancers, martial artists, climbers. These communities have already, and again, not to be overly assumptive, but they have a certain perspective of what a practice might already look like. And generally that revolves around some foundational strength and mobility work, a little bit of spinal organization, and most of those skill-based patterns that, are more kind of gymnastic centric. And then from there, starting to explore into other containers like floor work, soft acrobatics, et cetera. So, and being that most people coming in, let's say we started with something like soft acrobatics, they're not there yet. As much as I would love to just say, hey, we're going to teach these kind of what I would consider in the movement culture now, more peripherally based practices, at least from a perspective standpoint, I would love to teach all of that, but I found that it just has to be reduced to a certain foundation. But then obviously, as you know, below that can be problematic as well. Like if I'm just stuck on the ground doing mobility work all the time, maybe that's not the best approach. So
is there something you love to teach? Is there something that you're like, oh, I love to teach this one thing?
Something that I love to teach, I would say it continues to change based on really where I'm at in my own practice. And this is, again, going back to how the space started. I think like all of us, it's a combination of what I might see the community needs as a whole, and then what I'm also being fed and taught and learning and practicing, and trying to kind of hybridize those two. There was a point where I was moving way, way out on the fringe, and I saw that showing up in the space as well, and it lost a bit of connection. It's like I was a bit disconnected from this thing that actually was. And so I had to kind of bring that back a little bit. So, that's where for me, I would say, to answer your question, these movement exploration classes are right now my ability to not only set the expectation from the student mindset of like, hey, come in, you don't really know what you're going to get today. And also allowing me to teach whatever it is at the present moment that I want to teach. So I would say a lot of my teaching is improvisational. I don't necessarily, we do have structured classes and we build out programming, but mostly what I do is like real time.
Yeah, it's something I spoke with Tina recently on the previous podcast. Is she was saying the same, and it was something that really struck me in a way that I didn't expect, because historically I've taught classes where I've planned everything. When I was younger, I was really planning to the nth degree, and I was under the impression that this was giving the people attending the best possible service because I'd put the time in prior.
Right.
But as we spoke about off air, in a way, my goal in this conversation is to be with the conversation and not reading off a song sheet.
Okay.
And the same thing when you're teaching is when you're able to really be with the class and be with the people in that space, you can relate and give certain aspects to those people when they need them.
Yeah.
The problem is having enough, I think, practice and self-practice prior to actually be in that space of being able to improvise without just sharing bullshit.
Yeah.
Or sharing opinions that are unwarranted or unnecessary. And this is, I think, a really difficult philosophical line. It goes back to your point about wanting to share certain aspects with students, but then maybe not being ready yet. And then the question of when is someone ready? Who's determining when someone's ready or not?
Yeah.
I think there's not really a question there, but I really feel that sense of push-pull in everything we do. And yeah, I'd really love to hear your perspective on that, and then how you deal with all of those philosophical push and pulls, and when is someone ready? When do I move someone onto something, and how do I know I'm doing a good job if I'm improvising with these people? It's interesting.
It is a great question. It's interesting in that I will build out a framework in my mind. Let's say if I go into one of these classes, and it's very similar to what I was talking about initially with my own improvisations, and how, like, if I'm open, something new emerges, and this thing feels, again, like I use this phrase often, it just happens. This thing just happens. It happens through me, essentially. And it's in that I find some of the most potent ideas emerge. And then it's also allowing that to continue to flow from that place. And you're right, like it does require a certain amount of, let's say, backlog of skill and practice to arrive at that place. And I can't do that with everything, because there's, it's like I have kind of the leading edge of my practice, and then I have all that has come before. So I'm not going to be out here on the leading edge of my practice sharing something improvisationally that's not there yet. So there's that. And then, like, for example, I've got an immersion that I do once a year in late October, and I'll set a framework for that immersion of topics, but then I don't actually build out the content. To me, the topics dictate the content. It happens. And so some of that immersion is more conceptually based. I don't necessarily base it on skills. So it's a little different. It's a different layer. It's me getting to share in a way that is much more connected where I'm at in my own process. As far as like with students, I have had these debates, these internal debates myself, where sometimes I feel like I'm just like speaking to the wind, and I don't know, because ultimately I am not in anyone else's internal experience. So sometimes it can be challenging to know whether or not certain things stick or they resonate. And this is on purely, let's say, even a conceptual side or even a practical side, which is slightly different than maybe where they are in their physical practice. So like, for example, if they want to learn a handstand, there are certain benchmarks that need to be arrived at prior to moving on. So that's pretty easy. It's pretty standardized in that way. But then conceptually, with, let's say, the handstand being this vehicle that is helping drive concepts and ideas, I don't know. I mean, it's like the old question of like, why and when do we become aware of certain things? Like we don't really have a solid answer for that. And so all I can do is continue to show up and express what is coming up through me. And just knowing that like in some ways, not always, but in some ways, I'm just a little bit higher up the mountain. It's like, hey, I've seen a little bit more, I'm at 5,000 feet, maybe you're at 2,000 feet, not to make it, 5,000 feet is really no better. It's not better than 2,000 feet. It's just, it's on this path. Like it's just a little bit higher climb. And just say, hey, look, there's a snake at this corner. There's a rock over here. But then the path is yours. And however they arrive at that and whatever they pick up is really not up to me. So the best thing I can do, I guess, to summarize that is to be clear with myself and then just share what comes up and allow what sticks to stick. In this kind of relative space of what I might be perceiving the community to be needing or wanting, or so there is I would say to round that, there's a cap where it's just like I'm not untethered and just getting way out in the weeds. I'm trying to keep it to what I'm seeing in the group and in the space at any given moment. That was long-winded.
I like long-winded. It actually fits perfectly with what I was about to say. So rather than seeing things in like hierarchical ways, like on the mountain, for example, they're walking up the mountain. I really love this idea from Scott Barry Kaufman. He's I believe he calls himself a psychologist, and he studied Maslow. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs is probably a well-known idea. And it was very much a triangulation or a hierarchical type idea. But sadly, I think it's Abraham Maslow, maybe I'm wrong.
That's right. Yep.
He died abruptly, and his ideas weren't pushed to the level they could have been, maybe, or to the place they could have been. And Scott comes along and kind of rehashes his ideas and reads his personal emails and speaks to God knows who related to Maslow, and basically decided that the idea is better suited as a sailboat. And you have this hull, and you have these three ideas or concepts in the hull. And then you have the sail, and you have three ideas in the sail. And then you're sailing the high seas, and we're all at the whim of the weather and the sea, and we're really all in that same place together, therefore. And the better your hull is, the better secured you are, the better it can float. Or the lack of holes therein is one problem to deal with. And these are the kind of the basic needs of each individual human. And we could see that as kind of safety. And then we have the sail, which is very much the explorative, purposeful part of the boat. The thing that gets blown in the wind and driven towards a certain area. It drives the hull of the vessel towards a certain exploration. And it's a choice, therefore. And I really love this idea to really see that, maybe it's not that someone's higher or lower or better or worse, that maybe they just have more options to explore. And the better their hull is secured and the work they do within, and the better they're able to give themselves options with the sail, the better they're able to then explore and take on storms in their life and be there for others if they need to, rescue someone. I think it's a really poetic and nice metaphor to use for that self-understanding, self-exploration, and less hierarchical in a certain sense.
Yeah.
I as you can see, I love metaphor.
Yeah. Well, I like it reminds me of like integral theory or spiral dynamics in the spiral, because the spiral you can always go up or down. And, it's that idea too of like hold-on structures, in any given structure or any given system. It's a system of systems where it continues to grow outward, but it's like in that non-hierarchical. I mean, obviously in biology there's hierarchy, but we're in this kind of spiral, able to refer back down or go outward. And I think as we, a perspective I like is as we go outward, similar to what you're saying, and I take this even from a movement perspective. And, this is a bit of a whimsical idea, but I think about this like from this body mind, this container. It seems like there's an element too in skill development where we are able to, let's say, move these perspectives and create, literally this idea of the homunculus, which is our map, create a map and a structure, loosely structure, that is able to freely associate more clearly. So as I learn other skills, it's like this thing, specifically if we think about the skills as being involving multiple intelligences, this amalgamation expands, let's call it from center, or what seems to be like a center point. And in covering more territory, there is the ability to then cross-reference and freely associate, not only in practice, but within the life practice. And this does bleed in also into a bit more of a holistic viewpoint, which is, what I'm doing in my physical approach, my physical practice is no different than what shows up, because what is showing up is me. So when I step outside of the studio, my interactions, things that are happening, are a byproduct of this, amalgamation of change that's happening inside of the practice. So it's a bit, it's philosophical, conceptual, and romantic, but
It makes sense though. It made me smile because I think of evidences in my own life with my colleagues, friends, and also in myself, and I kind of feel like I've made a big jump in a certain area of my practice, and then I go home and I have a conversation with my mom, and I'm not patient, and I snap back, and I don't reference that let's say deeper learning in one aspect of my life, and then apply it into something else. And I think it's really interesting how common that comes up. And when we're maybe diving too deep down one specific avenue, it then doesn't reference back into the totality. Mm-hmm. I wonder if you've got any. I think you journal or you reflect somewhat. I wonder if you have any protocols or ideas that help you to ingrain that spiral or that circle in your life in a greater context. A conversation I had with Johson Round recently, he spoke about the main orientation of his practice was to be a better human. Mm-hmm. To allow his practice to inform him on that level rather than on the level of performance.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it starts to get, a bit, again, it's these kind of outer rungs, I guess, that are continuing to evolve. For me at the moment, there is a potentiality related to the practice, not necessarily what is the potential of my physical capabilities, but what is the potential of me as a human being, as a body, mind, however you want to think about it. And in that there is a freedom, a relative freedom, and, this kind of, this ability to see and steer the ship, to use your metaphor, see and steer the ship in a direction that it wants to go, like be open to that. Which then starts to get into essentially an awareness-based practice of, being more clear about my own conditioning and understanding where some of these areas of lack of movement, to use movement as a broader term, show up. So is there a lack of movement outside of my physical movement practice that is stagnating or limiting that potential and freedom? So I can't say that I have a methodology, because I don't really think there is a process for that or any sort of methodology to arrive at that. It just happens, and I can't I can't fully explain what that is or why it happens. But I do believe that this continual exploration of a movement practice, also in combination with, let's call it a stillness practice, allow for these continuums to be more clearly understood and explored, at least from my own perspective. But I don't regularly journal. I don't have any sort of regular reflective process other than a sitting practice and some stillness, standing practices. Yeah. I don't have anything that I can arrive at here. No gold nugget.
Good. That's also completely good, I think, actually. Speaking of golden nuggets, what was maybe the sugar pill or the skeleton key for you? Let's go back to the Brian Johson as a bodybuilder. What was the process of events that allowed you to move towards this or arrive at this perspective you have right now? Was there something that was like, wow, that's the skeleton key, I want to learn the handstand? Or was there something that drew you?
There were definitely, so looking back at that, there were definitely points that led and continue to kind of lead. And I would say the overarching is this thing that I was just talking about, which is being aware of, the ship and where it wants to go as much as I can be, and allowing this opportunity of me getting out of the way of myself, because I could have easily stayed in the bodybuilding realm. Looking back, at least for me, that would have been purely based out of conditioning, meaning like I enjoyed it. There was a lot of positive feedback and reinforcement there. I actually turned professional very early. I was in my early 20s, 22. And so there was a lot of feedback saying like, hey, you're good at this. So I recognized that I could have stayed there. For whatever reason, I didn't. There were some things that happened. I think getting into bodybuilding in the first place, it happened as an extension of sport and just being into sports. And then someone approaching me at some point saying like, hey, you've got a great physique as a bodybuilder. Have you tried it or thought about it? As a teenager. And I just laughed. I was like, no, I have no interest in that. Well, enough berating later, I decided to do it and was like, wow, this might be something that I could get into. But what I realized was it wasn't, for whatever reason, I had this slant towards what I thought was health then. So while there was an aesthetic component, I consider that to be kind of, for a lot of people, this core entry of they want to change how they look and feel. I realized early that it felt empty and shallow to me, in that I had arrived at what I thought was a look and a feel that was, gonna create this peace, bliss, and happiness. And it was an illusion. So that started me on this path of exploration of other ideas. And part of that was, at the time in my early 20s, this concept of what I thought holistic wellness was. So in my mid 20s, I actually opened a space here in Dallas. This was like in the early 2000s, called the Movement Dallas. And we were doing very progressive, what I thought then was very progressive kind of holistic client management, where we would, do nutritional typing. We would, work with them obviously on a movement layer. We were trying to include all of these other elements. And I think in that, again, it's like there were these steps along the way that allowed me to see something new, something different, something that allowed for a step into the next part. So when I was at the Movement Dallas, really heavy into nutritional, at some point I was wanting to kind of go that route and help people that way. We opened up a little kind of small farm to market store here in Dallas where we were bringing in local and organic food and raw dairy and all this stuff that really was hard to find here in Dallas. And then that ran its course, and I was kind of left in this like limbo area and had started playing around with just kind of gymnastic body weight stuff, and ran into gymnastic bodies at the time and kind of tinkered with that, and did some parkour, like in quotes, like just played really on my own. And then I think for me, it was seeing something with Ito back in around 2009, 2010. I saw that initial self-dominance video, which a lot of people have referenced. And I thought to myself that I could mimic what he was doing. And I thought I could arrive at some of his qualitative process and just really some of the skills that he was promoting. And I think what drew me to that, to kind of keep answering this question, is there was an aesthetic not related to the body, but a qualitative, maybe is a better way to think about it. There was a qualitative component to what he was showing that I was attracted to, that almost looked and felt artful. And so there was an expression there, kind of an artistic expression, that I also was drawn to in bodybuilding, because in that there was this like, I'm shaping the body, I'm molding myself, that I wanted to see if I could mimic myself. And I did that for 3 years and didn't really approach the quality that I was happy with. So I started working with him in 2013, 2014, and recognized that what I was missing was some key details. So it's kind of a standard in a way. And then a process. There was a process to arrive at some of these things. But in each perspective, I can look back and see that there was the aesthetic component, there was kind of the skill acquisition component, there was then this artistic expression component. And then that kind of has since led me to seeing movement as a vehicle and skill as a vehicle for potential freedom and self-understanding. And I don't know where that's going to end up, maybe, but the skill initially was, like you said, kind of a golden key for me to at least see if it was possible. Like, could I reach some of these benchmarks for myself? And in that, these other things continue to unfold. So it's like I'm sure you've experienced many times, once you get the skill, it's like my bodybuilding, it's the same thing keeps showing up. Once you get the skill, you wonder what else there is. It's like, okay, I've achieved a one-arm chin and a one-arm handstand, but like, I want to keep going. So yeah, no specific thing that I can like really pin down, but it feels very much related to continually wanting to express and understand this potential. And that has come through. I built this little kind of spiral model years ago, where it was like it was from my perspective, seeing the aesthetic layer, the skill layer, the artistic expression layer, this like unification and process oriented layer, and it just seems like expanding or opening up, however you want to think about it.
Was there one skill or element or something that you worked on for a long time that you're proud of out of everything else? Do you allow those personal gratifications?
It was interesting. Like there are some that are related to the tedium behind it, that that has its own thing. So like the one arm chin, for example, was super tedious for me. The one arm handstand is still something that like, I think in my best day, I could hold 15 seconds, but it still hasn't reached a level that I would be okay with, like moving on from. So I'll occasionally just kind of brush on it. Those two were the most tedious and ironically the least sustainable. So, the one arm chin, like I actually played around with it last week and I shocked myself. And I think in doing some of the things that I've been doing peripherally, it was available. The one arm handstand actually does become more sensitive, but the capacity, just because I'm doing less handstands. The other skills that I've accumulated and it's weird. It's like they don't really take much maintenance. So they seem less glamorous to me in that way, because they were hard work, like getting a Stalder press and some of these basics that Ito has promoted. They definitely took a lot of hard work and, resilience and understanding, but they stick around now because of the other elements of practice. They seem to be much more long-lived. But yeah, I would say the one arm stuff.
Yeah. How do you deal with dropping them, like moving away? Do you have a hard time moving away if you move away, or?
Yeah, that was part of the conditioning element, right? The recognizing the attachment too. So there still is this idea that I play with. I don't think there really is such a thing as maintenance. You're either going at it or you're not. And I can check back in on it and just kind of see where it is. But in not going at it, something is lost. So how long that curve will tail, I don't know. Like how long will I be able to quote unquote still do these skills or maintain them? I'm not sure. But I don't have a process for checking in on them other than like, oh, let me see. It kind of feels like this might be there today. And it is, and it oftentimes is. I do find myself attached still to some of those skills. And curious, like the check-in is a curiosity. And also behind that curiosity is still a desire to want to be able to do them. So now if I recognize I can't do it, I don't like, there have been moments where I'm like, okay, I'm going to do a week to like train this thing. And then what happens is a week goes by and I'm no longer motivated to continue training the thing. So I just let it go. So it's a regular check-in with that, and it's also a regular check-in with, it's easy for me to fall into those areas of practice because they're likable and they're approachable for me. Like I really like strength work. And so in that, there's a time cost that negates from these other areas that I could probably find more potency in, like object work or standing work, like working, like doing some kind of Feldenkrais material or somatic work. I don't necessarily like that work, but as I do it, like anything, you start to actually see the value and then like it. So yeah, there's always a balance of that. It's like pulling this way and pushing that way, and it's never perfect.
Yeah. I want to dive back a bit because you said something really lovely a little while ago about kind of giving students a greater context or allowing them to have a greater context. And I really think for me, that's been a big learning, is how movement was maybe communicated, and the movement culture was communicated in the early days was very much like, it's the pinnacle, it's the top of the mountain, it's the top of the hierarchy, and one day you might reach there. And it for me didn't really turn me on. It piqued my interest, but I didn't really engage as much as I maybe could have done because of this kind of communication. And I think what's really been evident for me is that actually it's the complete inverse. It's something that serves my greater context, my greater life, and actually to gain meaning from that, I need to implement it into that context. It can't be in and of itself a context. Movement in and of itself is kind of, as we're finding, a bit whimsical, a bit hard to define. It's like the slippery slope. And for me, what I've really enjoyed employing is some sense of like using movement as a vehicle to push me in certain directions. And therefore, inherently, anything I do within is meaningful. I have that greater context. For example, climbing. It gives me a lot on the social level, on that kind of relationship to myself and fear and stress, nature, being outdoors, etc. I wonder, going back to the conversation we had about people coming to the gym and basically wanting to look and feel better. How do you vocalize that greater context? How does that make sense to that perspective? Because you don't want to negate their point of view of, I just want to look and feel better, because I think on a certain level that's super valid. And actually it's about how do you allow that person to be part of the team without diminishing their want? Because I think, as we've both found, I'm not from bodybuilding, but I've definitely come from strength training and had a certain aesthetic drive, and still very much do have an aesthetic drive, whether it's how a movement looks or how I look doing it. I think it's a really interesting part of the practice, and I've come to accept rather than like hide it under the rug kind of thing. I'd love to hear from you how you communicate that with people that are maybe coming at it from the point of view of I'm in my mid-30s, mid-40s, I have a family, I have a full-time job, I'm looking for more. How do I engage and move forward? Because the disparity between fitness culture and movement culture is something there that we should address and discuss. And I'd love, first of all, to hear, do you have ways of communicating, moving them through, and then maybe we can talk a bit about that disparity.
Yeah, that's a great, very big question. So one thing that comes to mind is and this could be my own kind of bias or hang up, but I really have this draw towards complexity and this idea and concept of complexity, and allowing complexity to really be at the forefront of how I practice and what shows up in practice. So in that, I can often be a bit dogmatic about limiting particular modalities that don't offer an option of complexity within them. And, it's not to say that they're not valuable. It's just that if I'm, for myself, this is kind of my own talk track, but if I'm for myself wanting to explore potential, there is an aspect of complexity tied with that. So that I can communicate. So I can bring that into this question that you ask, which is recognizing that I also still have an aesthetic drive and desire myself that in many ways actually becomes a byproduct of a physical practice. So it's included, it's that kind of spiral approach. I can just go at it on the fitness side from a performative or skill-based or even aesthetic element. But in that, I'm limiting this aspect of complexity. I can make something more complicated, but it's not necessarily evolving to something that is organized in this whole way. So I can't really integrate or improvise with it. And this is a big driver for me, I guess you could say, is I'm looking for things that can be integrated and used all together. For example, how would I take a rock climbing wall? And it doesn't have to be, one thing I want to just add here is this is also slightly different than novelty. Like novelty and complexity, there's some crossover, but novelty might have a bunch of dead ends. Complexity, in the way that I think about it, would have this ability to integrate all the parts. So how do I take a wall, a floor, a stick? I mean, I don't know. There are definitely, even within my own practice, there are things to practice for practice sake that have within them, in their own system, layers of complexity. So for example, take juggling. It's like, I'm not going to be doing soft acrobatics with a juggling ball. Maybe, I mean, you could do that, I guess, but within juggling itself has its own layers of complexity built in. But I'm much more attracted to practices that can be amalgamated together through a larger process, because in that, I think we arrive at a potential that allows for us to more easily step into a flow state, for lack of a better descriptor. And I really am curious about that almost centerlessness quality of the flow state. But there is no me in that. So anyways, that's kind of the preface. So when I show up to teach, I do my best to communicate this idea of, it's really kind of Ito's approach that he coined, isolate, integrate, improvise. I talk about it from kind of a movement layer, skill layer, expressive layer. But I try to communicate that, hey, at this foundation, the next step is let's put some parts together. And then from those parts, so in any one given class, we might actually go from isolation to improvisation, or isolation to higher level integration, so that people can experience it in real time. And I think the experiential quality is the most important part. Obviously it could talk to it, but as you said, it's not arrived at until we actually go through it ourselves. So if I can take someone through even a snapshot of that experience, and then on the back end, talk about what just happened, it starts to better inform in their own process how to get there themselves. Yeah. And how, okay, we can take this concept, apply it, and this can show up in so many other areas of the practice. Yeah. Slightly different from the fitness approach in that it's a sliver of time. It's very fragmented in my mind. It's a sliver of time that is separate from the rest of my life. So it's like I go in, I do my 60 minutes of cardio and weight training, and it's very tactical feeling. Yeah. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just a different, it doesn't allow for movement beyond it. And maybe in many ways, obviously there's fitness body weight, but if we're talking about like fitness culture and gyms, in many ways, I think equipment is a limitation for that.
I think also fitness culture to a large extent has this large population of people punishing themselves.
Yeah.
They're taking that fragment as a way to punish themselves for something else in their lives. Yeah. Whether that's, partying, drinking, excess food, etc., or maybe more emotionally. I noticed in my young self, when I first got into CrossFit, it was definitely more of like a punishment, like you're not good enough, get better. Yeah, I wonder, something I wrote down when you were speaking is complexity versus volatility. And you kind of mentioned it in regards to novelty, but I think it's almost different again. When you've got someone coming in and, maybe they're mid-40s with a family and a full-time job, and how does one perceive complexity as something that is engaging and maybe conducive towards flow, comparative to something that's just volatile and stressful? How do you balance that?
Yeah, it's another great question. I think, there is an element of, it's, for lack of a better word, it's like not wanting to think, like offloading the cognitive capacity with something that is based in complexity, because it is body, mind, it's all of it, right? Whereas like, I think in fitness culture, or if I'm a weekend warrior or whatever, I can shut off, I can just do the body part. So for somebody that does, and I would say this is most people, And this was something that like I had to learn through my own process. Most people aren't movement teachers that have time in their day or that create time to have anywhere from 2 to 5 to 6 hours of practice or a full day. And they still, though, want and need a taste of this. So this is something we're actually working on even in real time, trying to chunk the practice in. I do realize that many people live in time constraints, and myself included. Like, here we are setting up time for this podcast. I have a sliver of 2 hours. So with that, how do we actually chunk the practice in something that feels manageable from a time perspective? So then taking and allocating, let's say somebody does want to approach, maybe they see the flow state as something that's interesting to them, or maybe just, a skill, because most people I'd say do come in through the skill oriented lens. They want to achieve the handstand or achieve some specific pattern. So taking the skill and saying, hey, okay, this 30 minutes is what's required X amount a week for you to actualize that skill. And really being clear about the commitment and the expectation of time. So now one of the things that I noticed, when I started working with Ito, for example, was how many skills were being approached at any one time. It was like, oh my God, it did require 4 or 5 hours a day, but maybe I want to create fluidity within my spine, and I can do that with 10 minutes a day. So I don't have to, have an hour or even 2 hours. If I have these little chunks and I can represent those chunks within a container or area of practice, then I can self-select based on that amount of time. And then that, I think, becomes an easier integration into the rest of their lives. So if I have 10 minutes and I'm cooking vegetables and I'm waiting for dinner to be ready, I can actually, in that time of 10 minutes, approach something that doesn't seem so intensive from a time standpoint. So that's one thing that I've been really working on and trying to parse out, whether that's strength work or, skill-based, something like hand balancing, or, some of the more peripheral layers of practice, so that it's clear for people. And as you know as well, like I have found this interesting kind of mix of what's required within certain containers of practice for maintenance, to kind of go a bit back to that, and what are skills that we'll likely have forever. And so I try to communicate that as well. So for example, if I learn all the ways of how to move my spine, if I'm, fortunate enough to live into my 90s, I still have all of those ways. Whereas I won't have a one-arm handstand in my 90s, most likely. So there are skills that I think are sustaining that can approach flow. I can approach the flow state in spinal improvisation that I can actually use and sustain throughout the course of my life. They're really there forever, barring some radical thing happening. So yeah, I try to communicate that to people that have less time. And usually also there's a combination of them having some sort of aesthetic based goal tied with it, but saying, hey, it might not have to look or be as time intensive as you may have thought or done previously.
I want to get into maybe differentiating or understanding a bit more the movement standard, or how you see it, at least, and as a space of study or practice or a gym space. Because we have, let's say, the classical fitness industry, and we've kind of brushed over this as a certain type of place and a certain type of person has a fragmented experience there. And then we have this maybe other world, which is yoga-oriented practices that are very much self-oriented practices, which could be seen kind of on the same kind of parallel to what you're saying. They're ways in which you can listen more and learn more about yourself, potentially. They're also just aesthetic in a lot of ways, the yoga practice, I feel. And then you have other kind of things that are seen as movement practices or places of movement, maybe a parkour gym or a climbing gym or I don't know, people that do circus arts. And I'd love to hear from your perspective how you differentiate your space, your work from these. Do you see them as parallels or adversaries?
Yeah, I got to this point. It's kind of tied into the complexity idea. I got to this point of recognition that, again, most of the people that might be coming in are coming from these other disciplines or practices, or, you know, kind of fitness oriented classes. And that oftentimes they were taking a part of this practice and trying to stuff it back into that particular discipline. You know, I see this a lot in the yoga community where there isn't an opportunity for process or practice in the way of skill development. So, you know, we have a lot of yoga teachers that want to learn the handstand because it looks good and they want these accessible skills and maybe something that they can offer, but then they take it back into a yoga process and there is no ability for practice. So it's actually the practice part that is missing. So that's one of the differentiators, is communicating what a practice could look like for this skill orientation versus entertainment, versus it being kind of a hobby. So in entertainment, you know, generally there's something that that's likable. You know, I like going to a yoga class. I like, you know, something new arising in each class, whatever. And then there's a practice side, which feels slightly different. It's actually moving me toward self-understanding by coming up against more diversity of, let's say in this case, skill acquisition, which requires in many ways that individual process. Yeah. So one of the things we've tried to do is take the individual practice side, similar to what I mentioned earlier, but then hybridize that individual practice inside of the community to where we're all practicing together individually. So it's like we have our individual process, but it's in a space where we can all be supportive in that. And then we also have the class element, which allows for this taste. So I don't think of these other practices as being adversarial. There was a time where I was dogmatic in that way. Now I actually see it as we're kind of all trying to speak the same language. And how do we recognize where the connection points are and then start from there, talk from there. I do often share this idea though of, and I like to make it clear for specifically teachers that come in and they're taking a part of the practice and taking it back, to think about fitting this, what seems to me, and it seems a bit hierarchical in the way that I say it, but what seems to me like a stepping into a bigger space. Let's say, you know, if I'm coming from a yoga practice and that represents a sphere, I'm actually stepping into something more that's not offered in yoga. And then I'm trying to kind of take the fullness of this bigger sphere and stuff it back into something smaller. So I often then just leave it up to them to question whether or not it's time to step into something bigger. So that's one little kind of breadcrumb. And not to say that bigger is better or that, you know, whatever. It's just that I've found that this gathering and accumulation to take back doesn't have a placement. It doesn't have a way for them to fully integrate into that practice. So, hey, maybe it's, you know, maybe we get rid of the mat and maybe we step into a few other ideas that feel a bit more expansive. But oftentimes, as you know, it's hard because we do become attached to that thing that we've done. So the differentiation, yeah, I would say is just, the differentiation is tough because there's a lot of ambiguity, and in that there's no real concrete place for people to pin us in their minds. So like, are they this? Are they that? We're not quite sure. Well, they're teaching these skills. Like, oh, that must be like this. We want to, you know, obviously associate like with like. It's like, oh, that's like this yoga studio, but it's not.
Yeah.
So we'll often use that in our speak to people. It's like, well, it's kind of like these things, but then we're offering these other things as well.
Mm.
And it's the reason why there's no elevator pitch. It's it's still, I would say, and I'm sure you experience this often, it's evolving, and it's like a bit on the frontier of what is, and with that there is no real placement for it.
Yeah. Some kind of dynamic learning space that's really
Yeah. So I would say it is, I try to promote it as an education. Like, you see a lot of people, they've shifted to this word school, it's like a movement school. And the education that is behind it comes through both the process and then, I'm sure, I'm sure going to other types of classes, there is some sort of basis for concepts being shared, but generally they're much more structured in terms of what they can share and how and what is being shared. So it's a free space for us to really do whatever we want, explore the edges, so to speak.
How do you find yourself sharing on social media? 'Cause I realize you made an effort similar to me to differentiate your space with yourself.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder how you manage that and how you deal with trying to share these tiny fragments of what you do with the world.
Man, what a tricky balance that is. I originally started this space, and then even the social side of it, not wanting it to be about me. It was like, I want to have something else that I can pump into, that is more about this collective practice and what we're exploring and what we're being shown, etc. The personal practice really just, the personal, let's say in this case, social, really just came about early on, sharing my process with Ito. I got on Instagram really early, and I was just taking photos of food and cars and whatever I was interested in, flowers, and just thought it to be a cool medium to have some sort of artistic expression of my own. And then that evolved into, oh, wow, I'm already taking these videos and sending them to Ito. Why don't I just post them here? And then that took its own life. And it's funny because even having the name Brian Movement, that was just on a whim. Back in probably 2007, when we had the movement standard, my email was Movement Dallas. My email was brian@movementdallas.com. And so I remember getting on Twitter one day, and they asked, you just username, what? Oh, Brian Movement. And so then that just stuck into all of my other socials. And my name is so common too. So, so then that kind of led into, well, I guess this could be a place for me to share the movement process or practice of my own. So where it's at now, I've kind of done this on the personal side, this full circle of trying to use it in a way that felt a bit detached from the medium that it was and is, is sharing a lot of, and who is it to me to say what's going to resonate with people? But I recognize when I shared these esoteric ideas and, kind of this kind of thinking where I was in my own practice, that it didn't resonate. And so that those things maybe could be held a little bit tighter to the chest or to the vest, however you want to think about it, to share either in the space with live students or in these immersive sessions or online students. And so then it's become more so sharing still my practice and process, but a bit more practically based. Hey, here are, some hanging variation, the simple stuff, here are hanging variations. Here's some things I do for XYZ. So it's kind of turned into that recently. And, it seems to be more resonant in that way. And then I still sprinkle in some of these other ideas, but I try to recognize the tool for what it is. And I, am working with that. The other thing I don't really do so much anymore is I don't really show much outside of movement practice. I used to show a lot more. I used to talk about these other areas of, health and wellness and all of that. And I just, there's so much noise and only so much time. And I, again, would prefer to save those for conversations where there's a little more time for nuance and, go at that route. Yeah. And then on the movement standard side, it's interesting because we're just showing kind of a mix of what's happening in classes, and it's still not really quite formed. I feel like that's actually going to start changing as well. And I haven't posted there in a couple of weeks, which is kind of a long break for that, because I feel like something else is wanting to be shared. So just kind of waiting for what that might be. But yeah, as we talked about a little bit before, these sites, I had this idea a long time ago that I could somehow show a holistic lens through a fragmented medium. And it's just not, I don't think it's possible. That medium is, hey, come practice with us. We have a space for that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think even in some ways, like a workshop can be limited in that, because you don't get to fully experience or immerse in again, that fullness, that richness of what's actually going on.
Yeah. Do you have any tips for young Brian? Anything that you've gained over the years that could be useful?
So, something initially comes up about curiosity. I don't quite have any sort of method or process around curiosity, because I don't think there really is one. But I do think there's kind of an open-ended opportunity for questions to be asked based around interest that can kind of lead the ship or steer the ship. So I would say, for people that are interested in a movement practice, as an example, what are you curious about? What is it that, like, ultimately getting into some of these deeper philosophical inquiries around the individual and where they're at in their own journey, whether that's, hey, I'm interested in like it's a six pack, or I'm interested in learning these skills, or, I'm interested in some sort of personal or spiritual development, like whatever it is, and then letting that be the directive for where it goes and how it unfolds. And I think through that, there is a ongoing, I was going to say education, but I think through that, if the curiosity is there, there's a motivation to want to educate yourself on whatever the thing is.
Sounds to me like you're big on listening, whether it's the listening to your own curiosities, or listening to what the community has to offer, or listening to what social media gives you in return. Is that something that you're consciously trying to implore, or is it something that just is in it?
Yeah, I would say now it is, and I'm not going to claim to be good at it, because it feels like there are many times where there's a head and heart misalignment, and it seems like part of my own journey and process is moving closer to what feels like alignment of the two. Obviously we need both, but I can live in the conceptual space, the philosophical space, and run with ideas that don't feel often grounded in, let's say, in my being, which this kind of heartfelt knowing. So yeah, part of my own, even starting this space, it was like, I remember the pull between really kind of the fear, the safety of an insecurity of, let's say, whether it's financial or people showing up or whatever, which is why I can tend to be relatively conservative in that arena, because, and it's a small space, because, I've generally not been the guy that's like, I'm going to go get, a huge building and just like blow it out with classes and all of that. So I do remember even that time 6 years ago, struggling between the two. It's like my heart knew I wanted a space and that it would work, but my head was blocking it. So using the two, we have both, but not, this is where the logic and magic part comes in for me. Not being too magical in my thinking, not being overly logical to where it's slowing down the process.
Beautiful full circle. We kind of maybe brushed over this at the beginning, but usually what I do to kind of round out the conversation is tie it back together with the metaphor. And so the beginning of the idea of the podcast is the metaphor, the five blind folk and the elephant, and really having these five individuals assess or discuss over this topic of movement is really the goal of this series. And I wonder if you have a metaphor that you hold dearly, anything that you have in your life that you like or are drawn towards. It might not be a metaphor, or it might be a quote or an idea.
In regards to the practice itself, or just something that shows up
anything
regularly?
I'm interested. I'm curious.
It's interesting because often when I'm teaching, these metaphors and insights just like show up. I'm sure sometimes they don't make sense or they fall flat. But it's almost like they come and they go. So different ones that just immediately arise and could relate to the head and heart conversation. I like this idea of mostly, I'll speak for myself, living in this place of a contracted ball. So if I have a red ball that's like squeezed and contracted, it's not the original shape of the ball. And part of the journey is allowing for that original shape to take hold or take space. And oftentimes it can be as simple as just letting go of the ball. So the movement practice for me has been a process of letting go, because there are so many of these conditioned habitual responses that get shown through skill. And so it feels like in my own process, I'm regularly trying to return back to that fully expanded ball. And I now have more clarity when I'm contracted, when I'm not in that place. So that's one I use often, and it was kind of given to me. But that also then relates to this idea that I shared earlier of practice representing a circle. And we could even take someone like Jung and approach like these dichotomies or these spectrums, thinking, feeling, sensing, etc. And using that as a representation of that ball as well. As I learn skill, there is more ability to freely associate between. So it's like two expanding circles that feel limitless. I recognize there are physical, mechanical limitations, but that the mind has no boundary. That's been my experience so far. So yeah, a bit, again, romantic, but I like to live in that space because it seems like there is more potential and freedom there.
I think there's no better way to finish the conversation on movement with potential and freedom. So Brian Johson, thank you so much. It really was a pleasure to have a short conversation. I think we could We could speak for hours. Almost did off air.
Yeah, maybe I can interview you next.
Yeah, dude.
No, I appreciate the opportunity, and it's just to have the ability to share multiple perspectives is rare. So thanks for having me. Great questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the nuance and the perspective and really the clarity from some of those whimsical questions. It was great to feel. And the seriousness you took that with was really nice to see. Where can everyone find you? What is the places that we can go to see more or to feel more?
Yeah, social seems to be the easiest. At Movement Standard is our facility here in Dallas. We do a little online stuff from there. We have a little foundations program and some other little offerings, but mostly we're trying to get people here in the space. And then at Brian Movement on Instagram, those are probably the best options from there. If someone's curious, they can reach out and learn more about what we're up to.
Beautiful. Brian, thank you so much.
Thanks, Will. Yeah, man. Have a good weekend.
Hi, I'm Will Brown. Thank you so much for listening. It's really a joy to have these conversations. Please feel free to like and share as much as you wish. It really helps us. And also keep an eye out for next week's release, where we interview yet another wonderful human. Again, if you'd like to see our coaching, courses, and event offers, please visit the website www.figuringthingsout.com. See you next time.